Okay, so we're trying to get into the second part of this course here. Cultural things, etc., which you'll use that blue book for some of the literary things that I will assign you. I mean, if you want to get ahead, I can tell you the sort of things that I will be signing out of that collection. For instance, we read the first section in here, in the second section, but chapter 3, Pre-Islamic Poetry and Manners, that's something you want to read. And then what else we have in here? We have some pages that are poorly preserved here. We have, for instance, some of this seems to have been not copied exactly the way we want it. But in the last part, Anthology of Islamic Literature, there's some overlap there between what Nicholson has and what we have in the first part. So you want to read also early Arab poetry there in the second part here, which is about page 53 of that. I don't like these collections, but since books are so expensive, sometimes this is easier to go. All the selections that are in the second part here under the Islamic, you should read all those, because those are really, I'm going to refer to all those. Now, in the aspects of Islamic civilization, including the pre-Islamic poetry, which seems to have, for some reason, dropped out. I don't know how come. And somehow that section got erased. And I don't know why. It should be in there, but anyway, we'll have to rely on the other person's translations for the pre-Islamic poetry. Because aspects, Arberry had some translations as well of the some of the major odes. So there were 3 areas that they were in, but somehow the one, I'll have to take it out of the original book when we do it, probably next time or the time after that. Anyway, I would actually read all that's left in this collection. That would probably solve everything. And we'll get to the different things as we get to them. Let's see. So we came up to the Mamluks, stopping the Mongols at what battle? Where was it? Ain Jalut in Palestine. Now the Mamluks succeeded Salah ad-Din and his dynasty in Egypt, called the Ayyubids. And they had succeeded the Fatimids in Egypt. The Fatimids fell in the Crusades. They weren't able to stand up to that battling situation that occurred around the 1100s. Crusades really were in the 1100s, finished up in the early 1200s. Salah ad-Din was the big hero of the Crusades, so he also was able to take over Egypt at that time. And his family persevered there for a while, but then they didn't survive him long after that, and this new Mamluk situation came in now. That seems to have been moving for a while, because I don't see how a Mamluk army could really withstand the Mongols in Palestine around 1259. You know, the dates, there's not enough time there for all this to happen in Egypt at that time. And I can't really clarify for you in this short period of time, but all these things from around 1180 to 1250s took place in a very short period of time, a generation or two, 70 or 80 years. And anyway, by 1259, the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt was flourishing, and we said it flourished until the coming of the Ottomans, and even beyond that. Because the Ottomans, although they defeated them, they didn't suppress them. They just used them as a sub-lieutenants, if you want to call them that. They farmed out the government to them in Egypt under their, probably had to pay taxes and things under their titular control, but the Mamluks still carried on in Egypt for another 400 years. So really the Mamluks in Egypt were working there for about 700 years. And I'm sure that has left its mark in modern Egypt, that there'll be an upper class that, I hate to use the color code language, but sometimes you can't escape it, that will be somewhat whitish or Turkish in its background. Caucasian, Caucasus Mountains, Circassians, different people from the Balkans who had been brought in as levies, Christian children, mostly Christian children who were brought in and Islamicized, but had no family loyalties to the situation in Egypt. And that became an upper class there. In fact, in the more recent history, Sadat Gamal Abdel Nasser of the 20th century, that's a native Egyptian revolution against those upper level people going on there. So for instance, the king that they deposed in the mid 20th century, the 1950s period, King Farouk, if you look at even his racially, I don't like to talk about racial things, but sometimes you can't escape it, he's European looking in his demeanor and his appearance. Whereas Nasser and Sadat are certainly more like what we would call fellaheen in Egypt, common people, the simple Egyptian taking power through the military processes. And that's still carrying on today in Egypt, that struggle. So I'm sure Egypt is a very big class society even now, going back to Mamluk days. In other words, this hasn't been erased. I met a princess when I was young like you in London, one of these princesses who was in the royal family in Egypt, and she was totally Turkish, if you want to call it that. That's how she looked. That was her behavior. That was her appearance. That was her ethos. She didn't look anything like a street Egyptian at all. And so there is this stratification that exists that we in the West are unfamiliar with, but the differences are there. Color codes are there. It may not be as pronounced as more intense color of the codes, but it's all still there, just beneath the surface. Which is why in the recent conference just last week on the Arabian Peninsula, I forget what country it was in, where they called for the democratization of Arab regimes under American prodding, Egypt resisted it, and Egypt torpedoed it. And the conference broke down in disarray. Egypt no more wants democratization than any other country in the Middle East really wants democratization. Because the class systems in these places are still very, very strong. It's almost like a caste system, actually. The Indian subcontinent, as some of you come from there know, it's almost a caste system. So, in any event, you have to know the culture of these areas to probably make much headway. And I don't think the American State Department or others are really into culture. They're into immediate policies that do not necessarily bring fruit. So the Mamluks' experience in Egypt has to be something that is understood as a long-term situation. Napoleon, in 1800, for some unknown, crazy, insane reason, went to Egypt and overthrew the Mamluk system. But after he left, it just basically reinstated itself. And even though he had an impact on Egyptian society in the Middle East and started a lot of Egyptian nationalism and modernization, and he did. The old system was only dented, it wasn't broken. It was only slightly, cracked. Why did Napoleon go to Egypt in the 1800 period? He was attacking the English. He didn't want the English to have an easy route to India. He wanted to make the English go around the Horn of Africa to get to their rich colonies in the East. He wanted to cut off the Indian trade from the British. that make it difficult. You know, if you got to go around the Horn of Africa with sailboats, you got a long way to go. You got a long way to go. Steam is a little better. But even with steam, they dug the Suez Canal in the 1860s and 70s to allow the ships to get to India and ports further east quicker, which has been the center of a lot of political fighting, infighting, real fighting, back and forth, one way or the other, over the last century after that. The French built it, but the English took it over again when they took over. Basically, the English took over India in around 1880 through various manipulations and machinations having to do with the canal. But they didn't fight to take over Egypt. They just basically took it over. Let's pass around a roll sheet. Can you rip out a piece of paper? And because I don't know where I keep leaving my roll sheets in another notebook. This is my only way to keep a check on the people who are sloughing off in the class here. So that brings us up to the modern period where Egypt goes. Now, the Marmaduke invasion, I told you, had a huge effect on the Arab Islamic world because, as I explained to you, they followed a scorched earth policies, and places that they conquered took a long time to recover, like Baghdad. Baghdad was taken by the Mongols, as we told you, in 1257. And aside from all the other dislocations that were going on, breakdown under the Buyids, who in the 900s were already taking over, the Seljuks in the 1000s. You remember the Buyids were a Shiite dynasty from Iran who took over. They left the caliph there. The Seljuks in the 1000s were a Turkish tribe, late 1000s into the Crusading period. These are Persians, these are Turks. They were still fighting people. So by this time the Arabs had stopped fighting and had become more of a citified gentry, feat, if you like, not really able to do serious fighting, maybe assassination or something like that, but not, mechanized fighting. And they left this to new Muslims like the Turks, who came in and were prepared to do this sort of thing. And the Turks continued to do this thing for 1,000 years. The Turks are still doing it. Turks, like it or not, have the best army in the Middle East. The Turks helped stop the Russian expansion through the Caucasus back in the Cold War days. The Turks fought in the Korean War. We've got great honor in the Korean War as part of the UN contingent there. Everyone who was on the UN contingent in the Korean War recognized that the Turks were some of the best fighters who were out there. The Turks stopped the British in the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War with tremendous casualties, almost destroyed Winston Churchill's career. The Turks are just well known for being terribly, stubborn fighters, and one assumes that they still continue in that mode up to the present day. They've become more nationalist. They're not part of the caliphate situation anymore. They have a modern country they call Turkey, which is an Ottoman successor state. But at the time the Seljuks came in, they were literally the fighters now. They were, to some extent, Islamicized paid mercenaries. And together with other groups in northern Iraq, like the Kurds, who were a quasi-Turkish group or somewhat related to the Turks, these people fought the Crusaders. They were the ones that fought the Crusaders. It wasn't Arab armies per se. Salah ad-Din, well, even though he's a famous Arab hero, he's not an Arab. Salah ad-Din is a Kurd, and so on and so forth. So the Crusaders were coming in the 1100s in northern Syria, pushed by the Byzantines there. The Mongols from the east were pushing the Turks westward. All this was overwhelming the Arab caliphates in the 10, 11, 1200 period. And by 1257 then was the death blow to the caliphate. The caliphate, was staggering. It had been, taking tremendous blows. It was surviving only by the leave of these generous amirs and sultans, Persian Buyids, Seljuk Turks, who wanted to keep the caliph as a figure. But after 1257, there was no more caliphate. The Abbasid caliphate collapsed, and there was no more Baghdad. It was burned to the ground, and everybody was killed. Everybody was killed. You know, it was scorched earth policy. And that's the point. As I told you, the center of the Arab world moved further west, behind the shield of the Mamluks. In other words, if you're going to have crazy warriors from another side, you've got to hire your own crazy warriors to fight them. So again, it wasn't the Egyptians per se who were doing the fighting. It was these levies of Islamized children from the Balkans and the Caucasus who were doing the fighting. So if you want to get an army to withstand another army that's very brutal and tough, you got to get some brutal and tough people. The Arabs were never this way, and frankly, to the present day, still probably aren't. In the Iran-Iraq war, like it or not, Saddam Hussein was using poison gas to make up the deficit in fighting skills. The Persians were extremely committed in that war recently, but he used these what now we consider to be discredited methods that supposedly triggered our entry into that area. And as you see, most of the fighting that's going on in Iraq, even though it's deadly and sad, is hit and run type fighting. It's like you put a car bomb along the road someplace, or you get a suicide bomber to do something. You're not having a pitched battle anywhere to speak of. Occasionally there's pitched battle. They don't last very long. So it's mostly this sort of hit and run guerrilla, if you want to call it that. I don't think it's guerrilla tactics. It's like, you know, mercurial sort of stuff. It is dangerous and lethal, but it's not war. It's more like assassination and terrorism than it is war. Americans just are unprepared for it. Americans can fight a regular war. They don't know how to deal with a thing like this, so it does wrong foot them, and they do look a little clumsy in this process. But unless the political will, it's not like the Vietnam War, where the Vietnamese actually could fight the Americans to a standstill in different areas. It's not anything like that. The only thing that will stop the Americans from staying there is the political will here in America, which is being undermined every single day on television, by the newspapers, by the publishers, and everyone else. That may produce a withdrawal and a defeat, but the Americans have, there's no way they can be defeated unless they defeat themselves, which is in fact what seems to be going on again, which is fine. That's up to the Americans. They want to defeat themselves. That's their own business. But the war they're fighting is not a war. It's a terrorist sort of pinprick kind of annoying thing. The Iraqis themselves are taking far more casualties as they slaughter each other. I read some guy was reporting on Charlie Rose last night saying there's something like 1,000 Iraqi casualties a week, not from the Americans, from the internecine fighting that's going on, assassinating, goon squads, everything else. That the hospitals, they don't even announce the numbers. They're so big. Oh well, forget all that. The point being, the war was carried out by these foreign groups. On the other side of it then, the Crusaders came in. They were a military order. And things really were shaken up tremendously. Now, just to come up to the modern period, I covered it, but I'll just cover it again. Some groups of Turkish tribes under Seljuk authority, as they had taken things over in the late 1000s, 1100s, further Turkish tribes were coming west, being pushed by the Mongols behind them. And most of them came from steppes of Central Asia, and they had to find a place to settle. So the Seljuks, who were in control in Baghdad, pushed these other tribes into Asia Minor, and they slowly made inroads into the Greek areas of Asia Minor in the wake of the failure of the Crusades. The Crusades were actually an attempt by the Byzantines to prop up these areas in Asia Minor and northern Syria. They failed. The Crusaders left, and so these Turkish tribes slowly pushed into Turkey. You see, we call this area Turkey, right? But you all know it wasn't Turkey back then. It was Greek. It was a Greco, you read your New Testament, Paul, he's traveling around a Hellenized Grecian area. And that's what it was until the period we're talking about, as the Byzantians began to slip after the Crusaders even attacked Constantinople and sacked it in the 1200s. By that time it was on its wobbly knees. And these tribes kept on pouring in, settling in. Today, Turkey is totally Muslim and absolutely Turkish. Now, I don't know if you did DNA tests, how everything would come out there. Whether they would all look, they came from Central Asia, or they would look Greek, I don't know. You'd have to, that's what's so great about DNA. We now have a measure that we can go into place and see what really happened in this place, not what the history tells us. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results sometime of what the Asia Minor DNA test would come out and show. It would be interesting. But in any event, we know that it's a famous date in history. Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman. They were called Osmanli, and late after that, they got a westernized sort of pronunciation, Ottoman Turks in 1453. And they made that their capital, and they changed the name from Stanopol to Istanbul, as I told you. And that became the center of another big empire that extended all the way around the Mediterranean, just like the Roman Empire had done previously, except it didn't get to Italy, just like the Alexander's Empire had done previously, just like the Byzantians had been previously. So the Turks did the same thing, making Byzantium, now Constantinople, then become Istanbul, their capital. And you can go to visit Istanbul. It's a little interesting city. They're trying to get in the common market today. But they took over all the areas around the coast and inland that we now call Arab areas, and North Africa, up to, I don't know, maybe as far as Tunis or so. And they were fought over the years by the Venetians, who were in competition for trade rights in the Mediterranean and so on. And this is the area where Venice is getting more and more powerful. And Venice had trading ports all over the islands in the eastern Mediterranean. So then you had all these various crusading orders that have been thrown out of Palestine that got into islands in the Mediterranean, Malta, you know, the Knights of the Cross, St. John of the Cross in Malta, and different Christian unpaved roads. They retreated to those areas, and the Venetians were involved in that as the people who were involved in commerce. But the Ottoman Empire didn't really crack till the First World War. The British did disconnect Egypt from them in the 1880s, and they were not able to respond to that. There was also a Crimean War going on with the Russians in the 1850s, which weakened them also. So you had a lot of, you had Balkan wars going on. You had Greek national independent movements going on in the 1820s, in which Lord Byron lost his life as a romantic who had gone to fight for the Greeks. Didn't die fighting, he died of a disease he got somewhere. But I mean, all this was disconnecting areas of the Ottoman Empire from the Ottoman Empire. So it too was being pushed, narrowed. And the First World War was its death knell. With the First World War and T.E. Lawrence organizing some of the Arab tribesmen to help, Lawrence of Arabia, it's in the movie and so on, they were fighting the Turks there in Palestine, Syria, Transjordan, northern Arabia. But the main thing that happened was the real British push came from Egypt. A huge army, or a really tough army, under a general called Allenby. General Allenby, drove through Palestine, took Jerusalem, drove on to Damascus, cracked the Turkish hold over these countries. The Arabs were a sort of adjunct, sort of guerrilla arm of this in Transjordan, led by Lawrence. Lawrence wanted to be paid off more handsomely than he was. He thought that the superpowers had cheated the Arabs out of what he had promised them. But Lawrence had made promises, but these generals were more hard-headed. So the French and the British made a deal to divide up the areas that they had taken between them. The British took Palestine and Transjordan, and the French got Syria and Lebanon. And the French had always been involved in Syria and Lebanon from Crusader days. And the church had always been very strong in those places, and the French saw themselves as protectors of the church. So in the 1920s to the 40s, that's the situation that obtained. But after the Second World War, where the British and the French had been really almost destroyed, they were not strong enough to hold on to these areas. And slowly these areas, through the UN help and otherwise, spun into independence. So you got really, in the course of this period, trusteeships from the League of Nations that were given to the French and the British in Iraq, in Transjordan, in Palestine, in Syria, and in Lebanon and so on. And slow independence. Lebanon, I think, was early on, and Egypt, quasi-independent until the monarchy was overthrown, then totally independent in the 50s. Then the British tried to come back in the Suez campaign to take the Suez Canal back, and with the defeat of that in the what was called the Sinai War, that was around 1956, Egypt really, under the new Egypt nationalist movement, Nasser and others, became totally independent. Nasser didn't survive the Yom Kippur War, rather the Six-Day War, very long, because his heart obviously had been weakened and he died suddenly. And the modern situation of his successors, Sadat and Mubarak, is what you're seeing now. So in any event, all these countries are called Ottoman successor states. And that's what some people don't realize. These countries have just been created recently. People talk about Iraq like it's been there for centuries. It's not been there for centuries. If it's been there for 75 years, you're lucky. In other words, it's a modern state of some kind cobbled together by people at various stages after the First World War. And originally, before the Second World War, under British mandate. The Iraq mandate was given to the British by the League of Nations. The mandate was something that the League of Nations, the predecessors of the UN, gave countries on the idea that they were going to try to prepare them for independence over time. There was a Kenya mandate, a Tanganyika mandate. There were a lot of mandates in East Africa as well as the Middle East. There were called Class A mandates and Class B mandates. Class A mandates were someone who was going to get independence quicker. Class B mandates was going to take a long time. And there was a mandate for Palestine, and to the mandate for Palestine was appended the Balfour Declaration, where in the middle of the First World War, His Majesty's government had promised the Jewish community in London in a letter that they would look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine once they had got things going. So whether that was good or bad or plus or minus, all that was part of these mandates. And we've seen the result of that now. So to go to Iraq at the present day, the people trying to hold it together as a sacrosanct entity are really looking at a maelstrom there, which doesn't really have a long historical background to it. And the people who never got a mandate and never got anything from anyone are the Kurds. And no one even knew there was a Kurd. I'm sure most of you, before 5 years ago, never even heard there were Kurds. And didn't even know that a Kurd existed. So the Kurds were, because of British manipulation and the oil situation in northern Iraq, manipulated out of everything. The Turks didn't want to give the Kurds anything because there were large portions of eastern Turkey were actually Kurdish, just as other parts were Armenian and other parts had been Greek. In other words, the Turks really didn't have a unified country there, and they wanted one. They certainly didn't want to give the Kurds anything. The Iranians had Kurds in western Iran. They didn't want to give them anything. And Iraq, under the British and the administration that they developed through the Sunnis there, didn't want to give the Kurds anything because that's where all the oil was. So that's where the situation we presently face, and you have a southern Iraq that's been Shiite since the days of Ali and his family. You have a northern Iraq that's Kurdish and a central Iraq that's Sunni, and if you'd taken these courses 10 years ago, you would have already known it. What they're going to finally do is mess it all up, obviously. I have no idea what the end is going to be, but I don't see that as a viable country. And it's going to be a hotbed of terrorism for years to come. And the Bush people just didn't do their homework, just don't know the history, and had no idea what their plan was when they went in there. They thought they were just going to be greeted like heroic liberators, and everything would be fine, and the people would work it all out. But as it turns out, everything isn't fine, and the whole place is in a deteriorating state of chaos. So the Americans will do what they did in Vietnam, pull out and run, and the whole thing will be still in a cauldron. I have no idea what the result will be, but that's the struggle background there. That's from the perspective that I can give you. Maybe there's a different one that you can get yourself, but I don't see what factors would be much different. Well, what part of the world haven't we covered? So the Ottoman Empire persisted on to the First World War. There was even a sultan who had all the trappings of being a caliphate. But then when the Young Turks, a party of army officers, felt that Turkey was being reduced back to the Anatolian mainland, and felt that the Sultan had become totally incapable of dealing with the modern world, they overthrew the Sultan in the early 1900s, even before the First World War, and put this Young Turk regime in power. And only kept him, like the previous people had kept the caliph as a figurehead, and then they finally even overthrew him as a figurehead. And after the First World War, with the triumph to some extent of the Turks over the British to some extent, not altogether. The British took all the areas in the Middle East from them, but in the Dardanelles they were unsuccessful. Kemal Ataturk, the famous Turkish commander at the Battle of the Dardanelles and elsewhere, took over the country. And he called himself Ataturk. That's the name he took. His name was actually Mustafa Kemal. And he took the name Ataturk, and he's become almost a saint in modern Turkey, father of the Turks. And he created the Turkish nation, abolished its alphabet, Arabic alphabet, brought modern European letters into Turkey. If you visited Turkey, which you have, it's all written in English or Western European characters. And it's a very interesting country in transition. And you see Ataturk's picture everywhere still, in everything, all the offices, everywhere you go, and all the currency. And no one knows what the final result of that will be, but it's a situation in flux. Okay, that's my history. Oh, I didn't do one thing, the conquest of Spain. I just want to finish that up, and then we'll move on to cultural things. I do like history, as you see. So, we talked about the Shiite issue up to the problem in Karbala. We'll go back to the Shiites after we do the Spanish situation. In Spain, as I told you, the Arab conquest went quickly, and it took all these areas, but it left this area unconquered. And over a century or two, this area coalesced again into a troublesome area. As the Arab tribesmen and others squabbled in Spain, some of the armies, as you know, got as far north as Tours. The French now call that Battle Poitiers. It's a field in between these two towns in central France called Tours and Poitiers. That's where the battle was fought in 732. And so people say that was the end of Arab progress in that part of the world, the defeat by Charles Martel of the Arabs at the Battle of Tours, Poitiers in 732. That's 100 years after the Prophet died. The Prophet died in 632. So in 100 years they got that far. India in the east, France in the west. Right? So, yeah, sit over there, that's fine. So, this Battle of Tours has been celebrated in Western lore, as I told you, in Gibbon's history. If the brave Frankish knights had not triumphed at Tours, the minaret would today be sounding from Oxford spires. Well, you know, I don't think, as I told you, it ever would have happened. And I told you the parenthesis that the culture of Europe switched to the north because basically the Arabs took over the control of the Mediterranean for a long period of time until the modern world. And then commerce was interrupted on the Mediterranean, had to be penetrated again by the Venetians later on. The Crusades were somewhat about that too. All these things are somewhat connected. But in Spain, we told you that you got the Umayyad Caliphate came in with Abd ar-Rahman I. Around 755. When he escaped the Abbasid retribution on all the previous Umayyads, and most of them were wiped out, their graveyards overturned in Syria, the center of the Islamic world moved to Baghdad. We know that Abd ar-Rahman, whose mother was a Berber, was smuggled across North Africa, presented to the Spanish Arab tribesmen as a possible leader. They had been rent by division and squabbling, and particularly the Qais Khal, the feud that we got in that one story was very strong. They imported it wherever they went as tribesmen. Some cities said they were Khals, some Qais. Some of the Ottoman emperors or caliphs were Qais, some were Khal. It was a very, deleterious thing. I read an account of Palestine backed by a British administrator in the middle part of the 20th century, the 1920s or 30s, and he was doing a census of towns in Palestine. He said, even in Palestine in the 1930s and so, where he was doing his censuses, the villages were identifying as Qais or Khal. Still, 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, you could still find in these vestiges of Qais Khal feuding going on, even in the villages in Palestine. That was the bird's nest story, you recall, that we read, where Kulai Khal made a vow over a bird's nest, and he was resisted by someone from a Qais background who whose client trampled on the bird's nest. That was the poet's view of the beginning of the dispute. Anyway, it was very enduring, and it carried into Spain. Well, but the Umayyads were very successful in Spain, and they carried on for another 300 years in Spain. They beautified Spain, had very beautiful cities there. Their capital was Cordoba. If you've ever been to Cordoba, you'll see it's a very beautiful place. There's huge minaret still in Seville, and of course Granada is one of the most beautiful cities in Spain to the present day. All these cities were part of Islamic control, and Granada was the last one to fall in the 1400s. But it's still totally Islamic city. And if you, how many have been to Cordoba? Anybody? Well, if you go to Cordoba, the main thing there is the Umayyad Mosque. It's still there. It's been turned into a church. It's been made totally garish with horrible paintings and things that wouldn't have existed in the mosque. But if you ignore all the horrible paintings of bloody crucifixions and things like that, and just look at the beautiful architecture of this splendid Muslim mosque, you can get some idea of the beauty that Cordoba had once been. So Cordoba was a really totally beautiful Islamic city. What happened? Well, they carried on into the 1000s fairly successfully, but things started to fall apart in the 1000s. The Crusades had started to get going. The Crusades were actually pronounced first in Spain before they were in the Middle East. Crusading armies went into northern Spain. And the Spanish started to reconquer parts of Spain. And this undermined the Umayyad Caliphate too. And the big event in Spain was in 1085, Toledo. So in other words, they'd gotten all the way down to there by 1085. It took them 300 years to get back down to there, the Christians, that is. So basically all that was left for the Muslims was these areas along here. And then you may have seen, if you've watched movies, late night shows about El Cid. He was an Islamic hero, but he switched sides always. Sometimes he was on the Christian side, sometimes he was on the Arab side, but all that is about the warfare in this area. It was about the 1200s. So this was moving down into this area. After about 1250, all that was left was Granada. And then when Ferdinand and Isabella got together and marshaled their forces, they took the rest in 1492. So by 1492, Granada fell. But that's a 700-year reconquest. The Muslims say, oh, well, okay, we lost Spain, but we gained the Turkish peninsula. So we lost one peninsula, but we regained another. There's some truth to that. They were unsuccessful ultimately in Spain, and they became successful again by almost at the same time that they lost Spain, Constantinople fell. So it's interesting. It's just a by-point of history. And funnily enough, Columbus set off for America in 1492 as well. And one of the reasons was that a lot of the intolerance that the new Spanish authorities, harking back to Visigothic days and the old legislation even before the Muslims came, now put back with a vengeance after what was called the Reconquista. All this is known in Christian history as the Reconquista. The anti-Jewish and Muslim legislation was very severe, and people knew that it was happening, and so a lot of the financing of the Columbus expedition was by people who realized they were going to be treated harshly and expelled, Jewish people and others. And Jews, doctors and others were part of the Columbus crew. Jewish financing to some extent was involved in that. To look for a new place of haven somewhere else in another world, in the New World. Well, they found it, but it didn't turn out to be exactly quite that way. But there's some reason, I mean, you see the Columbus journals, as he's sailing out of the harbor on his voyage, he sees the expulsees, people who've been expelled from Spain in their ships going to North African places, Muslims that were being expelled and Jews that were being expelled. And in Spain, the Jews and the Muslims were considered to be allies. They cooperated with each other. I told you, even at the beginning of the Muslim invasion, the Muslims would leave the Jews behind in the towns as governors while they moved forward to do the fighting. And in fact, Jewish culture in Spain was called the Golden Age of Spain in the Jewish lore. It was all in Arabic. They wrote their poetry in Arabic, they wrote their philosophy in Arabic, and they thrived as Islamic culture thrived. And all their poetry resembles Arab, Spanish poetry. All their literature resembles Arab, Spanish literature. And it was a golden age of both groups cooperating with each other. But then the expulsion came. And you can say that actually more Jews left than Muslims. More Muslims were converted to modern Spanish than Jews for some reason. I can't. By the way, I've been reading articles that out here in New Mexico and Texas and other places, a lot of Hispanic background people are looking into their roots and doing DNA tests to see if they're Jewish. And a lot of them are turning out to be Jewish. Conversos, they're called. And they're very excited about that. There's a whole blood bank to see what their actual DNA looks like and things like that. And there's an article in the paper recently about that. So there are, particularly in New Mexico, a lot of reconversions to Judaism going on in these areas of people who, for some reason, have found their roots. But even before the Reconquista was complete, the Arabs, the Umayyads were overwhelmed by Berber dynasties from Morocco, because as they weakened, they called in help from Morocco, and two Berber dynasties. I don't want to bore you with them, but one was called the Almoravids, and the other one was called the Almohads. These were very extreme Berber Muslim dynasties. They were not popular in Spain. They came in, they were military sort of help. They overwhelmed the former very free Spanish culture that we'll see when we read in our books Ibn Hazm. We'll look at Ibn Hazm called The Perfume Necklace, or The Dove's Necklace. A book so exquisite, so poetic, so sensitive, that you'll see how high the Spanish Muslim culture had risen. Well, the Almohads and the Almoravids didn't have this kind of culture, and there was a clash right away. And Ibn Hazm, the one that we're going to read, who's a representative of this, will even express this disappointment in the book. It's about love. He writes a book about love, which is totally unimaginable. It's courtly love. It's where the Christians get their idea of courtly love from. Not Courtney love, but courtly love. And you know, this courtly love ethic from Spain moved into southern France, the Provençal area, where it became the troubadour motif. So you got southern France being influenced by Spain, and the Muslim notion of courtly love that's evident in the Ibn Hazm type of literature. And in southern France, then, it became the troubadour singing about what? L'amour, 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 love, 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 which is where France got its reputation for being a love capital. But it actually came from Islamic Spain. And that moved then into Italy, and it became amore, amore, amore. And that gave rise to the sweet new poets in Italy. And guess who the biggest representative of that movement was? Dante. And Dante was the sweet new style. He and a poet called Guido Cavalcanti were the sweet new style, and they were influenced by the troubadour style, who in turn were influenced by the Muslim courtly love style that had already been going on in Spain for 200 or 300 years in the poetry and so on. And you know how Dante writes, if you know the Divine Comedy, about his love Beatrice. How many are familiar with that? And Beatrice is his heroine, but he meets Beatrice one day in walking on the streets of Florence. He just nods to her, but he never touches her. He never has any physical relationship to her. He only dreams about her. And for him, that's his heroine that he dreams about his whole life, and he makes her the hero of the Divine Comedy. This is courtly love with a vengeance. In other words, it's only an ideal that he's in love with. It's not a reality. And so that's the, by the way, I'm giving you the whole story of the Divine Comedy. You don't have to read it now, but you might, when you get a minute, take a look at those books. But it's all influenced by Muslim Spain. And in fact, Dante shows his knowledge of Muslim Spain. He actually mentions different Spanish cultural heroes like Averroes, the great Spanish philosopher, and others who he's familiar with through the translations that are going on in northern Spain and moving into southern France and Italy. Not only of Spanish Islamic works, but the Greeks then are being moved into Latin through translation mechanisms, sometimes into Hebrew, and then through other Hebrew co-religionists in France and Spain, in France and Italy, into Latin. There's another mechanism for the cultural movement. So the manuscripts that have been translated way back under the Abbasids in the 800s are in Spain in the 12 and 1300s, being translated into Latin. And they're now meeting Aristotle in Latin. They're meeting Galen. They're meeting Euclid. They're meeting all these old Greek texts, plus some of the newer Arab philosophers tacked on, like Ibn Rushd. Averroes, his Muslim name was Ibn Rushd. And so Dante mentions these people. He puts them in the highest circle of hell. You can't put them in paradise or purgatory because they're not Christian, but he gives them the best circle of hell to live in. And you can read the Divine Comedy. They're all mentioned. So he knows about them all. And their names have already moved into Italy. So the conclusion, very simple conclusion. It's the encounter with the Muslims, not only in the Crusades in the Middle East, but even more in Spain, that triggers the humanistic revival in Italy, the scholastic synthesis of Aquinas and Petrarch and these other people, Petrarch, the humanism, Aquinas, the scholastic synthesis, was totally based on Islamic Arabic philosophical texts that they had brought in from Spain, and then finally triggered the Renaissance. So the Western Renaissance was triggered by the encounter with the Muslim culture of Spain, and to some extent the Crusades, but the Crusades were just that. I have one text in there, Usama, a Muslim view of the Crusaders, which for the Muslims, the Crusaders were just a bunch of rough thugs, roughnecks who, and honestly, I'll be truthful about it. I'm hurrying here because I want to get as much in as I can. Who farted a lot, you know, who were only interested in the brothels and things like that, and whose table manners were horrible, and who had no elegance and absolutely no culture. And the picture the Muslims give of the creators is a little biased, but I'm sure it's fairly accurate. It's one of basically a bunch of uncivilized, uncultured, warlike brutes that have descended on them. And it's in your collection. At the very end here, it's you can read it. I'm not sure how I get the time for it, but it's called Usama, A Muslim View of the Crusaders. It's hard for me to find this stuff here because there's no index here, but hopefully you'll find it. If you want a good laugh, read that. That's a very funny picture. And I often, if I have more time, I haven't missed a lot of classes at the beginning, I read that to my classes because I find that to be extremely funny. Now, okay, so the situation in Spain had a large effect on what happened culturally in Europe thereafter. The contact with this very high Muslim culture, which after the coming of the Almohads and Almoravids was suppressed in southern Spain. So it wasn't long before all of Spain fell under Muslim control in the final conquest of Granada in 1485. Granada fell, and then the Inquisition was brought into play to ferret out lukewarm Christians, to ferret out people who were still secret Muslims and secret Jews. And that's a perfectly horrendous period. It goes on for a couple of 100 years and has marred and marked Spanish culture up to the present day. Also, the behavior of Spain and Latin America has been marred by that. And the whole encounter of Spanish with the New World had that as part of it, and it's been a very gruesome, ugly history. I frankly don't understand how anyone can get any feeling of inspiration or comfort out of any of it. The treatment of the Mexican rulers in Teotihuacan in Mexico, the treatment of the Inca rulers, the Aztec rulers in Teotihuacan in Mexico, and also in their capital city, I forget what it was called, the capital, whatever it was called. It was horrendous. The devastation, the disease, the killing, everything was just horrendous. Peru is beyond imagination what a small army of the havoc a small army of Spaniards wreaked there, and also the repression thereafter, based to some extent on the Inquisition and so on. It's beyond my comprehension how anyone from Latin America or further south is able to live with this history in any sort of equanimity. It's just a frightening sort of history that I wouldn't even be able to contemplate if I came out of those areas. It's something beyond my comprehension. Never mind, that's as far as we'll go in that direction. I promised you I would do the Shiites. I do want to do the Shiites. Now, the Shiites, I said, for a while under the Abbasids, it looked like the Abbasids were making an effort to conciliate the Shiites. And so I mentioned that one Abbasid caliph who had two sons, he was called Al-Mansur, and he succeeded his brother Ja'far. And these were the first Abbasid caliphs. And these were called Al-Ma'mun and Al-Amin. And I don't know what the problem was between them, was some problem, but this is in the early 800s. You know, 820s or so. And for a time, the stories tell us there were 3 or 4 translation houses, as I told you, operating side by side, translating Greek and other Western manuscripts from the time of the flourishing of Greco-Roman culture into Arabic. All of Plato, all of Aristotle, all of the scientists, all of the geography, Euclid, everything else was translated into Arabic in Baghdad at this time, particularly under Al-Ma'mun. And he was the one who had some relationship with the Shiite imam. to try to sort of amalgamate the Abbasid with the Shiite Imam. It didn't work out for some reason. And this is where you get a sort of breaking point too in Shiite history. So let's just look at that before we move totally over to the cultural sphere. So I want you to read for next time. I think we should look at probably the pre-Islamic Bedouin Arab poetry. So look at the various chapters of your book. There's one missing here. I don't know what happened to it. I'll have to bring that in myself and read it to you from that. But in terms of the Imams, the Shiite Imams, you know, the first is Ali, of course. We know what happened to him. Then Hassan. He more or less peaceful life, died in his bed, but he wasn't very aggressive or anything. He was in retirement in Medina. He was on a pension. But Hussein was different. Hussein did lead a group up at the time of Muawiyah's death, and as we know, was slaughtered by the Umayyad police in approximately 680. So he died 661. He died 680. So we're already into 3 Imams. They're all considered Imams. Now, what is an Imam? Literally, an Imam means to stand before. Originally, it was the prayer leader. But I think, since I've worked on this Jewish-Christian stuff, there is an idea of in Jewish Christianity, as I told you, it's in the Koran, of the primal Adam, who, the idea was something of a Buddhist idea, who becomes incarnated in every generation. And it's a kind of a Christ who gets incarnated, and he puts on a new body in each time. The Imam, I think, the standing, and in some cultures, this primal Adam was called the standing one. I think that's where they got the term Imam from. That's my own personal, that's not a proved point. That's my own research. I have never tried to put it in any formal way except suggested, but I think the idea of standing in front of the standing one, the incarnation of some divine precept of some kind, came into Islam under the name of Imam. You know, you're a Sunni, right? So you have an Imam too, but he's not a supernatural being. He's the leader of the prayer on Friday, right? Yeah. So that's normally what an Imam would be in a normal Islamic setting, particularly from the Sunni standpoint. But from the Shiite standpoint, it's much more magnified. And it is almost like a Christ figure. But it does descend, something like the Christ figure in Palestine descended through the family of Jesus on the brother of James side, and we have a little bit of that in the family. You have a family caliphate in Christianity too. The family caliphate of the brothers and their descendants and so on in Christianity as the head of the church. James in the literature is called the Bishop of Bishops, and he's over Peter. So you have a family caliphate successorship in Christianity too, which survived in the Middle East and may have influenced all of these things. I think it did. On the other side of it, Paul is not family. Paul, in fact, is an enemy, opponent. And his form of Christianity is the form you all are familiar with. Whether you know it or not, every single Christian in the room is a Pauline Christian. And it's his form of Christianity that has survived in the West. But he was looked upon by these other forms of Christianity that we now know, and I'm sorry to inform you of that, most people don't know it, but we scholars know it, that Paul was looked upon by the other groups further east as an antichrist. And there were huge squabbles, but you know, as all things in history, the victors write the history. So the Pauline groups became part of the Constantine Empire and the Curia of the Roman Catholic Church and the Church Fathers, they're all Paulinists, they all write the history. All the history of these other groups is lost in the desert of nowhere. Ah yes, but recently the Nag Hammadi texts have come to light, and I can assure you there's no text at Nag Hammadi in Paul's name, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have come to light, which I think, from my research, are anti-Pauline materials. And of course the Orthodox Christian groups don't think that that's what they are, but I'm convinced that a large part of them are that. And so on and so forth. So we've now got some literature from these opposition groups, not completely Christian, scrolls aren't Christian, because Christianity hadn't formed yet. Christianity only forms under Paul's writing circulations. It hasn't formed in Palestine at the time of the writing of these documents. So we do have family caliphate in Christianity, and so you have in Islam the Sunnis that following the tradition of the ancestors and consensus, and the Shiites following the family of the Prophet in an imam supernatural way. But not so much the Prophet as Ali. Now, how that occurred, I don't know. How Ali, I think for the Shiites, even though they pay attention to Muhammad and the Koran, Ali is superior in some sense. The Prophet is not a supernatural person, but Ali is. So, you see, that's how these ideas, I think, filtered in. Look, how does this happen in religion? You have in America Mormons, don't you? They find a scripture in New York State in a cave. You know, Myra, New York, right? Whether some fellow called moron put it there or not, I have no idea. Maroney or whatever, that's where we get the word moron from. Now that is true. People making fun of that. Whether Maroney, some individual in the literature put it there, or someone laterally, you know, that's a thing, you know, Mormons have to work with, but to my mind, it doesn't matter. Because most religious documents to me are forgeries anyway, so including the gospel. So it doesn't really matter to me if they're a later forgery or an early forgery. They don't tell the events as they actually happen. I know you're going to hate me for that, but that's my personal view, and I'm just telling you that right off. So I'm not against the Mormons having a document, or the Shiites having a document, or anyone else having a document from their perspective. That's how religions form. Mythological stories about supernatural beings, and people who are the adherents think these stories are absolutely true, so they get angry when they hear about someone else. So a person who takes the New Testament gets angry about the Book of Mormon. Why? They're basically the same kind of book. So I wouldn't really get angry about anybody. It's just the Mormons are more recent. But we can see in the Mormon history how these things happen. New documents are either written, come to light, or formed, and offshoots occur. So in the Ali thing, in early Islam, new things develop. And I think what they were importing is this primal Adam idea from these other Judeo-Christian groups that were in the area. We know they were there. They still are there in southern Iraq in the Mandaeans, plus some Buddhist ideas. The Imam idea has a lot in common with the Buddha who is reincarnated in each new generation. The Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of the Buddha. Well, that's just like the Imam, being a reincarnation of Ali. Now, the Sunnis in the room will say, this is not Islam, and will object to this heartily. I understand that. For them, it isn't Islam. Now, I always know when someone is a Shiite or a Sunni, because the Shiites are very, very generous. They say, oh, yes, we're all Muslims are brothers. You meet a Sunni, and they say, no, these people are not Muslims. This is not the Islam. The Sunnis are much more rejectionist about this, and less cosmopolitan. So I always know when I'm speaking to a Sunni or a Shiite, because their reaction, the Shiite wants to be embraced because he wants other Muslims to embrace him. The Sunni is saying, no, this cannot be, you know, and so on. I understand what the problem is. I can't solve the problem. It's not for me to solve. I can only look at it. But the Shiites, then somehow this succession from Ali turned supernatural and became a kind of incarnationism. I don't know how it occurred. Somewhere in this situation here. Where are we? Oh, here. Somewhere in this situation here, that happened. So, around the time of Al-Ma'mun, I think the 6th Imam, I can't remember the name of the other Imams there, not many there, was named Ja'far, sort of like the name of the original Abbasid. And that would be around the time that Ma'mun was doing this thing with trying to make some kind of reconciliation. You know, the Abbasids made propaganda in the name of the family of the Prophet. If we could get the actual family of the Prophet from Ali involved with them, we get a strong unifying force. He was going to marry one of his sons to one of the daughters of the previous Imam. Something happened and something fell through. Or he was supposed to marry one himself. Whatever happened, there was a break in the Imams here between the 6th and the 7th. This 7th Imam was called Ismail. Now, there was another son of Ja'far called something else. I forget what his name was. Muaz or something. I can't remember what his name was. Now, the groups that go down here to 12 imams say that this imam here, Ismail, is illegitimate and shouldn't have been recognized. In other words, it was a break. And they go all the way down to 12 imams, the last of whom is called, I think, al-Mahdi. And this is where we get the idea of the Mahdi from, the expected one. Which is sort of like the return of the Messiah in Judaism and Christianity. So you get the Mahdi, who in local parlance is known as the expected one. In any case, these 12 Imam Shiites over here are called Ja'faris. Even though that was not the name of the 12th Imam, after the break here under Ja'far. That's the name of the 6th Imam. The 7th Imam Shiites are called Ismailis, after the name of his son, who they say was the legitimate successor, and this other line here was not. Before that, there was a 5th Imam. We've got a lot of them here. His name was Zayd. We're only missing one Imam here. Forget his name. I should probably find out who he was. Anyway, Zayd, there was a break after Zayd too. And his followers said Zayd was the hidden Imam. Now look, the hidden Imam is an idea that develops out of all this. It's, and they're called Zaydis. So you have Zaydis, Ismailis, and Ja'faris. Later on, they give birth to other groups more laterally that we would call Druze, Baha'i, and Alawis, or Nusayris. So you see this Shiism is extremely fertile. It's extremely able to, like a biological development, when you get, what is it, when a biology, something new happens, what's it called in biology, when a new creature comes, there's a...
mutation?
A mutation, now that's it. They're really capable of mutation. Yeah, evolution, of course, but mutation. They can mutate into something else really good. Sunnism is much more solid, much more conservative, much more, you know, down to earth, rock bottom. It doesn't entertain any of these ideas. But Shiism is capable of endless innovation, which is what we're seeing today. People underestimated Shiism a lot, you know, and underestimate what's going on in Iran at the present time. Underestimate the Ayatollah Khomeini. Underestimated a lot of these things. Didn't understand how rich and varied and capable of innovation and mutation Shiism was. Thanks for giving me that word out. Without that, I wouldn't know where I was going. So this has been very, very, very rich. But the three we know for sure occurred in terms of development are Zayd, Ja'far, then Mahdi later on, and Ismail. So those are called 5 Imam Shiites, 7 Imam Shiites, and 12 Imam Shiites. The big group that we have to deal with at the present time are 12 Imam Shiites. They're called Ja'faris. They're the ones basically in Lebanon and in Iran, where the main centers, and in southern Iraq, where the main centers of this are. The other ones have gone further out. The Zaydis went down into Yemen. They still may be there. Bahrain, places like that. And Ismailis went way out into India. And as I said, now they function. Then they went to East Africa from India when the British brought them there as laborers. The young lady who teaches the other Islam course, her husband comes from Madagascar, I think, and originally from India, and he's an Ismaili. So I shouldn't give that information out, but that's you know, that's how that would happen. But in any case, they go much further afield, and But in the Middle Ages, they were in Lebanon too. In the Middle Ages, they were in Lebanon too. And in fact, most of the killing that was going on during the Crusades, there was a whole succession of assassinations, both of Sunni leaders. The famous Seljuk leader was assassinated. His name was Nizam al-Mulk. He was assassinated. Christian knights were assassinated. The assassination were being led by a person called the Old Man of the Mountain. There was a mountain in Lebanon, and there was also a mountain in Iran called the Eagle's Nest. And the legend was that he used to bring his adepts up there and feed them hashish and stuff to get them crazy, and then send them out to do these assassinations, like the suicide bombings today. And the Old Man of the Mountain, the Crusaders called him. And these were Ismailis. These were not 12ers. These were 7ers. And when the Mongols came east, they destroyed Alamut, which is the Eagle's Nest in the mountains of Iran, north of Tehran, and wiped this place out, which was a hotbed of Islamic assassination, even at that time. So, you know, we have a whole history of this in Islam. There's nothing new today. It's just assumed different proportions. To me, bin Laden is a combination of the Ismailis and the Harajis. I don't see any difference at all in what's going on today as what went on 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. And so there's a long history of this, but the Ismailis were known as the assassins. Now they own country clubs in the Riviera because the East African emigres got so rich they gave the money to their leader, who was at that point called the Aga Khan, who married in the old days in America. That was very famous because he married Rita Hayworth, the biggest Hollywood star of the World War II period, and everyone knew who she was. And so on, and his son was, he was going to marry her, Ali Khan, and he was a race car driver and stuff like that, you know, and finally killed himself. He took a, drive into a tree someplace, but his race cars, horses, so nothing to do with the assassins of the old days. So I want to tell you a little more about how the assassins and the 7ers were the Fatimids. They became the Fatimids. They came to Egypt, and then when the Caliph died there at one point, called Al-Hakim, his descendants or his propagandists started making propaganda in the Lebanese mountains, and his propagandist was called Al-Darazi. And Al-Darazi is the name we get the Druze from. And the Druze in the Lebanese Syrian mountains are the descendants of the Fatimids in Egypt, who say that the last Fatimid caliph in Egypt was the hidden imam, and that they're making propaganda in Lebanon and Syria for the return of this caliph, and that's where we get the modern Druze from. So next time, make me start with the hidden imam, okay? I want to tell you about the hidden imam. And then we'll do a little pre-Islamic poetry and Islamic law and stuff like that. What can you read about this? I have no book that gives it all in any way serious manner. Keep reading Bernard Lewis. That's about the best I can do for you.